Right now, not in 1973, not in some future war game scenario, but right now, there is a stretch of water so narrow you could theoretically see both shores from a cargo ship's bridge. And if something goes wrong there, a missile, a grounded tanker, a single bad decision made by a nervous commander on a patrol boat, the price of everything you buy goes up. Fuel, food, medicine, your morning commute, your electricity bill. We're talking about a corridor just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, and nearly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil on this planet passes through it every single day. The name of that corridor is the Strait of Hormuz, and what most people don't know, what the news almost never covers, is that for decades, engineers and geopolitical strategists have been quietly designing a way out, a radical escape hatch, a canal so massive it would reshape the map of the Middle East and potentially rebalance global power. Most people have never heard of it, and the reason it hasn't been built yet will either make you feel relieved or terrified. Stay with me, because this next part is where it gets genuinely unsettling. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz matters the way it does, you need to stop thinking about it as a geography problem. Start thinking about it as a circulatory system. The Persian Gulf is the heart, the strait is the aorta, and the global economy is the body. When Marcus Reynolds, a senior oil market analyst who spent 15 years advising energy funds in Houston, first mapped this dependency for his clients, he told them something they didn't want to hear. He said, "This is not a risk that hedges neatly. This is existential." Because the numbers are staggering. On a normal day, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products move through the Strait of Hormuz. That is roughly 20 to 21% of total global oil consumption. In dollar terms, at even modest oil prices, that corridor is carrying somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 billion worth of energy every single day. And because oil is the base input cost for nearly everything, plastics, transport, fertilizer, manufacturing, a prolonged disruption doesn't just spike fuel prices, it triggers inflation cascades that hit grocery stores, hospital supply chains, and household electricity bills simultaneously. And the countries most vulnerable aren't always the richest ones. It's often the developing economies, including nations across Southeast Asia and Africa, that feel the supply shock first and hardest. Sophia Reyes, a maritime logistics coordinator based in Manila, put it simply when she said, "When the Gulf sneezes, we in the Philippines catch the fever. Fuel prices go up, fish prices go up, everything goes up." That's the real stake here, not a geopolitical chess match between superpowers. Real people, real prices, real pain. Let's place ourselves on the map, because the geography here is everything. The Persian Gulf is a roughly 600-mile-long body of water shaped like a stretched kidney. Along its western and southern shores sit some of the wealthiest oil-producing nations on Earth. Saudi Arabia, with the world's second-largest proven oil reserves. Iraq, whose southern oil fields pump millions of barrels daily into waiting tankers at the port of Basra. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, each contributing their share to what is effectively the world's most concentrated energy export zone. Together, the Gulf Cooperation nations hold roughly 40% of the world's proven crude oil reserves. Now look at where all of that oil needs to go. It needs to reach refineries and consumers in Europe, Asia, North America, South Asia. And to get there, almost every barrel must funnel toward the same exit, the southeastern tip of the Persian Gulf, where the water narrows and bends around the Musandam Peninsula of Oman, passing within miles of Iranian territorial waters and emerging into the Gulf of Oman on the other side. There is no other practical exit from the Persian Gulf by sea. The geography of the region created this choke before any nation drew a border. And that natural architecture of land and water means that any country with the ability to project force near the strait, particularly Iran, whose coastline runs along the entire northern edge, holds extraordinary leverage over global energy markets. Most people miss this. It's not just that the strait is narrow, it's that the narrowness was never designed. It's geology, and you cannot negotiate with geology. Here's a number that should stop you cold. On a single average day, not during a crisis, not during a war, just a regular Tuesday, 17 to 21 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz. To visualize that, imagine filling roughly 1,200 Olympic-sized swimming pools with crude oil and moving them all in 24 hours through a gap the width of a mid-sized American city. The tankers doing this work are engineering marvels in themselves. Very large crude carriers, called VLCs, are among the biggest moving objects ever constructed by human hands. These ships can be 330 meters long. That's longer than 3 American football fields laid end to end. They carry up to 2 million barrels of oil each, and on any given day, there are dozens of them in transit through the strait simultaneously. The shipping lanes, the actual navigable channels, are just 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles, with ships that size, with Iranian warships watching, with U.S. Navy carrier groups somewhere over the horizon. And insurance markets know this. When tension spikes in the Gulf, the cost of insuring a tanker for a single voyage through the strait can jump by hundreds of thousands of dollars in hours. That's the market putting a number on fear. And right now, that number is climbing. But here's where it gets interesting and uncomfortable, because this vulnerability isn't theoretical. This isn't a future war game. The Strait of Hormuz has already been the stage for some of the most dangerous maritime confrontations since the Second World War. In the 1980s, during the so-called tanker war between Iran and Iraq, more than 400 ships were attacked in the Gulf and the surrounding waters. Oil tankers were bombed, sailors were killed. The USS Stark was struck by Iranian missiles. The USS Samuel B. Roberts hit an Iranian mine. The U.S. Navy was actively engaged in shepherding tankers through the strait under armed escort, and that was decades ago. More recently, in 2019, there were a string of incidents that pushed the strait to the edge of something far worse. Tankers were sabotaged near the Emirati port of Fujairah. Oil tankers were seized. A British-flagged vessel, the Stena Imperio, was boarded and seized by Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces in the Strait of Hormuz. UK Marines had briefly detained an Iranian tanker off Gibraltar weeks earlier, and this was Iran's answer. James Harrington, a geopolitical risk analyst who had spent years advising insurance underwriters in London, described the moment like this. That seizure was a message. Iran was showing the world it could reach in and pull a ship out of the shipping lane at will. That is not a small thing. The strait did not close, but the possibility, broadcast in real time to global energy markets, was enough to send Brent crude prices lurching upward by 4% in a single trading session. That's the physics of this place. Perception alone moves markets worth trillions of dollars. Marcus Reynolds still keeps a laminated map on his desk at his Houston office. It's a simple map, the Persian Gulf, the Strait, the Gulf of Oman, with a red circle drawn around the narrowest point. He's had it for 12 years, and whenever a new client walks in and asks where the single greatest systemic risk is to global energy markets, he slides that map across the desk without saying a word. He says it works every time. But what Marcus will tell you, quietly, away from the conference room, is that the part that actually keeps him up at night isn't the strait itself, it's the cascade. People think about Hormuz like it's an on-off switch. It's not. It's more like a volume dial. You don't have to close it completely to cause catastrophic damage. You just have to make it unreliable, make shipping companies nervous, make insurers spike their premiums, make tanker captains think twice before committing to a Gulf route. You do that for 6 weeks, and you haven't started a war, but you've started an economic crisis. That's a level of strategic leverage that most militaries can only dream of. And the unsettling reality is that multiple actors, state and non-state, understand this leverage exists and have shown a willingness to use it. This isn't analysis, it's recent history. And recent history is telling us something very specific. The Strait of Hormuz is not a permanent feature of a stable world. It is a loaded variable in an equation that keeps changing. But here's where it gets interesting, because while analysts like Marcus were circling that red dot on the map, a completely different group of people, engineers, military planners, economists, were asking a completely different question. Not what happens if the strait closes, but what if ships didn't need the strait at all? For decades, buried in the planning documents of Gulf states, in the white papers of energy think tanks, in the footnotes of geopolitical strategy reports, there has been a recurring idea, a bold, audacious, almost outrageous idea. What if you built a canal, not across flat desert, not across open sea, but directly through the mountains of Oman's Musandam Peninsula, the rugged finger of land that reaches northward into the Strait of Hormuz like a stone barricade, a canal that would let tankers bypass the entire strait, entering the Persian Gulf from one side, exiting directly into the Gulf of Oman from the other, bypassing Iranian territorial waters, bypassing the congested 2-mile shipping lanes, bypassing every naval standoff, every seized tanker, every insurance spike. On a flat map, it looks almost obvious. You're looking at a relatively short stretch of land, a few dozen miles in some places, separating two bodies of water. The canal writes itself, except it doesn't. And the gap between obvious on a map and possible in reality is where this story gets genuinely extraordinary. Sophia Reyes doesn't talk about oil in terms of barrels. She talks about it in terms of fishing boats. Sophia grew up in Batangas on the southwestern coast of Luzon in the Philippines. Her father ran a small fleet of fishing boats, and when global fuel prices spiked after the Gulf tensions of 2019, the diesel cost for those boats nearly doubled in 4 months. Her father had to cut his fleet by half. 3 fishing families in their barangay lost their primary income in a single season. Sophia eventually made her way into maritime logistics. She now coordinates shipping schedules for an international freight company in Manila, and she became, in her own way, a student of the Strait of Hormuz without ever having planned to be. When people in Manila or Cebu or Davao ask why fish is expensive, she told us, nobody connects it to a strait on the other side of the world. But the connection is direct. It's diesel, and diesel comes from oil, and oil comes through Hormuz. This is the invisible thread that runs from a 21-mile strait in the Middle East to the price of a plate of bangus at a Filipino market stall. Sophia's story is not unique. From Lagos to Jakarta, from Chennai to Cape Town, the strait's vulnerability radiates outward in price signals that millions of people feel but rarely trace back to their source. And that invisibility is precisely what makes the problem so persistent. You can't solve a crisis you can't see clearly. To be fair, the problem of Hormuz dependency is not entirely unaddressed. Governments and energy companies have tried and continue to try to reduce their exposure to this choke point. Saudi Arabia, for instance, completed a 1,200-kilometer pipeline called the East-West Pipeline, also known as Petroline. It runs from the eastern oil fields near Dhahran all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. On a good day, it can carry around 5 million barrels per day. That's significant, but Saudi Arabia alone exports around 6 to 7 million barrels daily, so even its own dedicated pipeline can't fully replace the strait. The United Arab Emirates took a similar approach. They built the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, often referred to by its routes terminus, connecting the UAE oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait entirely. At full capacity, it moves around 1.5 million barrels per day. Again, significant, but UAE daily exports regularly exceed that number. And crucially, neither of these pipelines is available to Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, or the smaller Gulf producers. They each have their own infrastructure constraints, which means that when you add up all the pipeline capacity currently available as a bypass to the Strait of Hormuz, the total is somewhere around 7 million barrels per day, against a daily flow through the strait of nearly 21 million. The math is brutal. 2/3 of the world's Gulf oil still has no alternative route. Not today, not with current infrastructure. That gap, that 14 million barrel per day gap, is the real size of the problem, and it's the gap that makes the canal idea irresistible. So, let's talk about the canal, properly, Because the idea, when you lay it out in full, is either the most visionary infrastructure project ever conceived or the most expensive fantasy in engineering history. Depending on who you ask, you get both answers with equal conviction. The concept is this. In the Musandam Peninsula, that rugged northern finger of Oman that reaches into the Strait of Hormuz, there are several locations where the overland distance between the Persian Gulf coast and the Gulf of Oman coast is relatively short. In some corridors, the two bodies of water are separated by as little as 30 to 50 kilometers of terrain. That's the width of a moderate mountain range. The canal would need to cut through that range, connecting the Persian Gulf on the west to the Gulf of Oman on the east. Ships could then enter the Persian Gulf, load their cargo at the terminals in Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE, sail to the canal entrance, transit through the cut, and emerge in the open Gulf of Oman, free of the strait, free of Iranian territorial waters, free of the political volatility that has made the strait so nerve-shredding for tanker captains and insurance actuaries alike. Nathan Brooks, an energy economist who has studied Gulf infrastructure for over 2 decades and now teaches at a university in Washington, D.C., called the Musandam Canal concept the most elegant theoretical solution to one of the most inelegant geopolitical problems of the 21st century. Elegant, but theoretical, because the land between those two bodies of water is not flat, it is not sand, and it is not empty. The Musandam Peninsula is not a gentle landscape. It is part of the Hajar mountain range, one of the most geologically dramatic terrains in the entire Arabian Peninsula. These are not rolling hills. These are limestone massifs, jagged, ancient, frost-fractured peaks that rise as high as 6,900 feet above sea level. The coastlines don't slope gently to the water. They plunge almost vertically from cliff faces directly into the sea. The interior is a labyrinth of narrow wadis, deep fjords cut by centuries of flash flooding, and exposed bedrock so hard that drilling through it would chew through equipment at staggering rates. Maria Santos, a civil engineer from Cebu who now works on large-scale infrastructure projects across the Middle East, visited the Musandam Peninsula as part of a regional infrastructure survey team in the early 2020s. Her description of the terrain was unambiguous. When you're standing in those mountains, you stop thinking about a canal and start thinking about survival, she said. The rock is beautiful and brutal. Every meter of a potential canal route would require serious blasting, serious reinforcement, and serious money. For a canal to accommodate the vessels that actually carry Gulf oil, VLCs, the supertankers we mentioned earlier, the channel would need to be a minimum of 300 meters wide and at least 25 meters deep, possibly more. The volume of rock that would need to be excavated is almost impossible to visualize at a human scale. We are talking about the displacement of hundreds of millions of tons of solid limestone, not sand, not soil, limestone. To understand what excavating a canal through the Musandam Mountains would actually mean, you need a reference point, and the best reference point is Panama. The original Panama Canal, completed in 1914, involved the excavation of roughly 232 million cubic meters of material over a decade of work. It was one of the largest and most difficult engineering projects in human history. It required cutting through the continental divide of Central America. It cost approximately $375 million at the time, which, adjusted for inflation, represents billions of today's dollars. And it killed thousands of workers in the process. The Panama Canal expansion, completed in 2016, added a third lane of locks and required a further excavation of 130 million cubic meters of material at a cost of approximately $5.25 billion. Now consider the Musandam Canal. Geologists and engineers who have looked at the terrain broadly estimate that the excavation volume for a VLCC-capable canal through the Musandam would likely exceed the entirety of the original Panama Canal's earthwork, perhaps by a factor of 2 or more.
and Panama was cut through relatively soft rock and tropical soil, with a reliable tropical workforce, in an era when canal engineering was at its global peak of ambition. The Musandam Canal would involve cutting through some of the hardest limestone formations in the Arabian Peninsula, in extreme heat, in a region with almost no fresh water, in a geopolitically sensitive zone where a construction accident or a security incident could derail the entire project at any moment. Cost projections, where anyone dares to make them, run from $150 billion to $300 billion, possibly more. That's not a budget. That's a war economy. Dr. Carlos de la Cruz doesn't carry a laminated map. He carries core samples. Carlos grew up in Pampanga in the Philippines, earned his geology degree at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, and eventually made his way to a career specializing in Middle Eastern geology, first in Abu Dhabi, then in Muscat, where he spent years studying the structural geology of the Hajar Range. He is not an idealist about the Musandam Canal. He's been inside the rock. The formation is called the Samael ophiolite, he explained during our conversation. It is oceanic crust that was abducted, essentially pushed up over the continental plate during a massive geological event around 90 million years ago. What you get is extremely dense, extremely hard rock with complex fracture systems throughout. It's not uniform, it's not predictable, and the fracture systems mean that any large excavation carries significant risk of unexpected water infiltration, seismic instability, and slope failure. Translation: the mountain doesn't just resist being cut, it actively fights back. The engineering challenge isn't just volume of rock removed, it's the behavior of what remains. A 300-meter-wide canal cut through fractured ophiolite rock would require continuous monitoring, reinforcement, and structural intervention along its entire length. The canal walls themselves would need to be engineered like a continuously active construction site, not built once and maintained, but built, rebuilt, and reinforced indefinitely. And all of that is before you account for the seismic activity in the region. The Musandam Peninsula sits in a tectonically active zone. Earthquakes are not theoretical here. They are periodic and real. $300 billion. Let's sit with that number for a moment, because the moment you say $300 billion, most people's eyes glaze over. Numbers that large lose their meaning. They become abstractions. So let's make it concrete. $300 billion is roughly the entire annual GDP of the United Arab Emirates. It's more than the entire annual budget of the U.S. Department of Defense. It's more money than has ever been spent on any single infrastructure project in human history, not even close. The closest comparable, the International Space Station, cost approximately $150 billion over its entire construction and operational lifespan. The Channel Tunnel, the rail tunnel connecting England and France under the English Channel, cost around $21 billion in 2024 dollars and was already considered breathtakingly expensive at the time. A Musandam Canal, at the high-end estimate, would cost more than 10 channel tunnels. And the economic return, while theoretically enormous in terms of global energy security, is deeply uncertain. Who pays? Who profits? Who controls the tolls? Who owns the canal? These are not rhetorical questions. They are legally and diplomatically catastrophic questions that have derailed far simpler infrastructure projects for decades. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. Even if you solved the engineering, and even if you solved the financing, you still have not solved the most fundamental problem of all. Because this canal would need to run through a country that has never asked for it. The Musandam Peninsula belongs to the Sultanate of Oman. This might seem like a straightforward fact, but its implications are anything but. Oman is a fascinating country, geopolitically unique in the Gulf, in ways that make the canal question even more complicated than it first appears. Oman has historically positioned itself as a mediating power in the Gulf, maintaining diplomatic relations with Iran when most of its GCC neighbors were at odds with Tehran, maintaining ties with Israel before most Arab states normalized ties, and consistently choosing a path of quiet pragmatism over ideological alignment. Under Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, who has continued the measured strategic posture of his predecessor, the late Sultan Qaboos, Oman has focused its development energies on tourism, port infrastructure, logistics, and the Duqm Special Economic Zone on its southern coast. The Musandam region itself is being developed carefully and gradually as a tourism destination, its dramatic fjords and mountain scenery drawing comparisons to Scandinavia and attracting growing numbers of regional visitors. There is no official Omani government plan for a canal through Musandam. There hasn't been one. When asked about it, Omani officials have consistently redirected conversations toward port development and logistics corridors rather than any trans-peninsular cutting. And this matters enormously because a project of this scale cannot be imposed. It cannot be built with financial pressure alone. It requires the sovereign consent and active cooperation of the Omani government at every level. That's not a negotiation that happens in a year. That is a generational diplomatic project. Suppose, for just a moment, Oman said yes. Suppose the next sultan or a future government decided that a trans-peninsular canal was in fact in the national interest. What would actually need to happen next? Let's walk through it. First, you would need a multilateral financing agreement at a scale never previously achieved for a single infrastructure project. The probable investors would be a coalition of Gulf sovereign wealth funds, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the Kuwait Investment Authority, combined with international infrastructure bonds and possibly involvement from institutions like the World Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Negotiating the governance structure of that consortium alone would take years. Who votes? Who vetoes? Who gets preferential access to the canal? That's a fraught negotiation. Second, you would need a long-term security agreement. A canal of this strategic importance would immediately become one of the most valuable and most targeted pieces of infrastructure on Earth. Who protects it? Oman doesn't have the naval capacity to secure a high-traffic international canal against state-level threats. Would the U.S. Navy guarantee it? Would a GCC joint force? Would the UN be involved? Each answer creates a different geopolitical outcome and a different set of countries who would try to destabilize the project before it ever opened. James Harrington called this the protection paradox. The moment you announce you are building an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz, every actor who benefits from the strait's volatility has an incentive to make sure the canal never opens, and some of those actors have very effective tools at their disposal. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about, even the people who support the canal idea. Even if every obstacle were overcome, even if the engineering were perfected, the financing secured, Oman on board, the security guarantees in place, you would not have eliminated a choke point. You would have created a new one. Dr. Carlos de la Cruz raised this point during a panel discussion in Dubai that he described as an unusually honest for a conference full of optimists. He said, "A canal is a single point of failure. It is by definition narrower than the strait. A 300-meter wide canal is physically easier to block than a 21-mile strait. A ship run aground in the right position could block it for weeks. A single explosive device detonated in the right location could cause a structural collapse that takes months or years to repair. You are not removing vulnerability, you are concentrating it. This is the fundamental irony of the Musandam Canal concept. The Strait of Hormuz, for all its terrifying narrowness, has one geographic advantage. It is a natural waterway. It cannot be dynamited shut. It cannot be grounded in. It heals itself. A canal does not heal itself. A canal, once blocked, stays blocked until human hands unblock it. And human hands can be delayed. They can be prevented. They can be threatened. The global economy would trade a natural choke point that is difficult to close for an artificial one that is comparatively easy to close. Whether that trade is worth it depends
entirely on your threat assessment. And threat assessments in this part of the world change very fast. So why does the canal idea keep coming back? If the engineering is this hard, the politics this complex, and the strategic logic this flawed, why do serious people keep returning to it?
The answer, when you sit with it long enough, is that the canal idea is not really about a canal. It's about a feeling. It's the feeling, deeply human, deeply understandable, that the world's most critical systems should not depend on accidents of geology and the goodwill of hostile powers. Sophia Reyes articulated it during our final conversation in a way that stayed with me. When my father's fishing business collapsed because of a price spike caused by something happening in a sea he would never see, she said, I thought, why does this have to work this way? Why is the fate of his livelihood connected to a strait he's never heard of? And the answer is, because nobody built a way around it. That feeling of structural fragility, of unchosen exposure, of a world designed not for resilience, but for efficiency at the expense of everything else, is what keeps the Musandam Canal alive as an idea. It is a symbol, a statement. It says, we could design this better. We could choose to be less vulnerable. And in a world that keeps discovering, painfully, how its critical systems are fragile just when it needs them to be strong, that idea has enormous emotional and political power, even when the engineering says otherwise. The Musandam Canal is one idea in a long human history of trying to redesign geography, and that history is more instructive than most people realize. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, did exactly what the Musandam Canal proposes to do. It cut through the Sinai and connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, eliminating a 7,000-mile route around the Cape of Good Hope. It was called impossible before it was built. It was called world-changing after. And then, in 1956, Egypt nationalized it, triggering a military crisis that nearly became a world war. The Suez Canal today remains a single-lane choke point for much of the world's non-Gulf trade, a fact that became viscerally apparent in March 2021 when the container ship Ever Given ran aground in the canal and blocked it for 6 days. The global cost of those 6 days? Estimated at $9.6 billion per day in delayed trade. One ship, 6 days, billions of dollars. Then there's the Panama Canal, which we have already discussed, and the Strait of Malacca, through which nearly 80,000 ships pass annually, carrying roughly 40% of global trade, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, between Yemen and Djibouti, through which Red Sea shipping must pass, a strait that has been actively threatened by Houthi attacks in recent years, forcing major shipping lines to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope at enormous additional cost. The world's trade system is a network of these bottlenecks, and every time one is threatened, we are reminded of something important. The modern global economy was not designed for resilience. It was designed for speed and efficiency at scale is fragile. Here is the final thing to understand about the Strait of Hormuz and about the canal that may never be built through the mountains of Musandam. The real lesson of this story is not about engineering. It's not even about geopolitics. It's about how the world actually functions versus how we wish it functioned. We tell ourselves stories of resilience, of systems designed to withstand shocks, of infrastructure built with redundancy and vision. But the reality, from Hormuz to Suez to the Mississippi River's lock system to the data centers that run the internet, is that the systems holding the modern world together are often far more exposed than the people who depend on them are allowed to know. Marcus Reynolds still has that laminated map on his desk. Maria Santos is still working on infrastructure projects in the Gulf. Dr. Carlos de la Cruz is still studying the ophiolite rock of the Hajar Range, and Sophia recently accepted a position with a regional maritime think tank that is actively exploring new resilience frameworks for Gulf shipping dependencies. None of them believe a canal will be built in their lifetimes. All of them believe something must change, because the strait is not going anywhere. The mountains of Musandam are not going anywhere. But the volatility, the tankers seized, the insurance premiums spiked, the fuel prices radiating outward to fishing fleets in Batangas, and freight costs in Lagos, and grocery prices in Seoul, That volatility is not going anywhere either. And the next time you see a headline about the Strait of Hormuz, you'll know something most people don't. You'll know what's really at stake, and you'll understand why the canal, impossible as it sounds, keeps finding its way back to the table. The next video in this series looks at the other 3 global choke points that most people have never heard of, and the ones most likely to trigger the next great supply chain crisis. Comment below which choke point you want us to cover first, and if you want the full research notes from this video, drop canal in the comments. See you in the next one.